The warning was clear. The United States announced it would raise tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, doubling them from 25% to 50%. It was billed as a show of strength, a move to protect American industries. But what came next turned into one of the most devastating counter-punches in North American trade history. Canada responded with surgical precision, cutting off America's access to critical steel and aluminum supplies. The scale was staggering. Canada accounts for nearly a quarter of all U.S. steel imports and about 60% of its aluminum. Last year alone, Canada shipped over $24 billion worth of these materials south of the border. Now, that pipeline is closing fast, and the effects are rippling through the American economy. What made this retaliation especially painful is that it struck at the very industries Trump's tariffs were supposed to protect. Instead of shielding U.S. manufacturers, the trade war has left them scrambling, facing supply shortages and skyrocketing costs. Analysts warn the shock could slash U.S. GDP by up to 8%, while endangering more than $330 billion worth of American exports. For decades, U.S. factories were built on the reliability of Canadian steel and aluminum. These weren't just imports, they were essential foundations of American cars, construction, technology, and defense. When Canada tightened the screws, U.S. companies were left with no easy alternatives. Contracts were cancelled, production lines slowed, and long-standing business relationships collapsed almost overnight. The spark that ignited this firestorm was relatively small. Ontario introduced a new tax on electricity sold to 3 U.S. states. Washington saw it as another example of unfair Canadian practices. Trump's team threatened sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and eventually all Canadian goods. That's when Ottawa decided enough was enough, and struck back with devastating impact. On the Canadian side, the economic pain is real, but more contained. Steel and aluminum represent about 0.5% of Canada's GDP. Yet in Ontario and Quebec, regions where these industries are concentrated, the fight carries enormous political weight. Ontario Premier Doug Ford pushed for an aggressive response, while Prime Minister Mark Carney deployed his trademark strategy, measured, precise, and calculated to inflict maximum pressure without destabilizing Canada's broader economy. The numbers show just how integrated these two economies truly are. Canadian exports to the US account for anywhere between 7 and 34% of provincial GDP, depending on the region. Alberta, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan are especially vulnerable. But Canada calculated that by targeting specific sectors, rather than broad-based tariffs, it could create disproportionate pain in the United States while managing its own risks. That gamble is paying off. American companies now face a brutal choice: pay sky-high costs for inferior materials from elsewhere, or suffer production delays that could stretch for months. From auto plants to tech companies, the fallout is being felt in every corner of the economy. Workers face layoffs, prices for consumers are climbing, and entire industries are losing their competitive edge against international rivals. For Trump, the political damage is mounting. His tariffs were meant to project strength, but instead they have exposed vulnerabilities. Manufacturing states, key to his political base, are now openly voicing frustration. Businesses that once supported his tough stance on trade are now warning of collapse under the weight of higher costs and broken supply chains. Canada's timing was ruthless. U.S. manufacturing was already under pressure from labor shortages, global competition, and lingering supply chain issues. Cutting off affordable steel and aluminum at that moment delivered a knockout blow. Instead of ushering in an industrial revival, Trump's strategy has left many American manufacturers weaker than ever. Yet, the bigger picture shows how deeply intertwined these economies remain. Even amid this escalating trade war, Canadian exports to the US were still 2.5% higher in early 2025 compared to late 2024. Trade continues in many sectors, but the steel and aluminum conflict exposes just how fragile modern supply chains can be. Decades of integration under NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA, created industries so interdependent that no tariff can neatly sever them without enormous disruption. The lesson is clear: trade wars in today's interconnected world rarely produce winners. Instead, they inflict widespread damage, raising costs, destroying trust, and leaving both economies worse off. Trump's attempt to force concessions has instead triggered a spiral of retaliation, one that may leave lasting scars on North American trade. The question now is whether the damage can be contained, or if the economic wounds will take years to heal. For businesses and workers on both sides of the border, the pain is already real. And the longer this trade war drags on, the harder it will be to repair the relationships and supply chains that once made North America's economy one of the strongest in the world. This is True Estate Report. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.